can we speak about inkwells? Is there any disadvantage or any big no-no in transferring ink from the proprietary bottles to a crystal or glass inkwell? How to handle inks with pigments or particles such as J Herbin 1670 series? Anyone using inkwells at all? So you really kind of just like throw in the towel at the end there. You can totally use inkwells. Very, very, very acceptable to do. The most important thing when using inkwells, honestly, is just making sure that it seals well. Because fountain pen ink is water-based, and if you don't have it sealed well, the water is going to evaporate out of the ink, and you're going to be left with just the dyes and the other components of the ink behind. It's going to be much less fluid, sludgier, drier writing, not going to perform well. Honestly, if you took a bottle of ink and you unscrewed the cap and just left it sitting out there, you'd actually be amazed in a number of days how visibly that would go down and be left with very thick, sludgy type ink. So the cap sealing well is really, really important. And when you're using a crystal type inkwell, you want to make sure that the cap seals well. That's really kind of the number one most important thing. A next important thing is just making sure that the inkwell is clean, because whenever you're transferring ink from one to another, if you go to an antique store and you buy some really, really old thing that's like dingy and yellowed and stuff like that, you don't want to just like wipe it out with a paper towel and then pour your ink in. You want to actually clean it, maybe use a little bit of bleach in there to like make sure that it's completely, really, really clean. Wash it out after that too to make sure it's crystal clear, pun. And then you can put your ink in there, and that's okay. So just making sure that it's clean is another good thing. Another thing too, so when you're talking about like a crystal inkwell or something like that, generally you're going to want those because they look beautiful and you're going to keep it out. So the only thing I would say is you can totally do that, but with most fountain pen inks are dye-based, right? They're dye-based, which means that they are, it's a lot of aniline dyes that are used in fountain pen inks. So that means they're not very light fast, generally speaking. So they'll be fine, for everyday writing, and they'll be cool for lasting a really long time if you have them closed up in a notebook. If you're journaling and stuff like that and you keep it closed up, don't be too worried. Where you want to be concerned a little bit is if you're leaving your writing or your ink or whatever out there in direct sunlight for extended periods of time. So if you happen to have a beautiful office with a corner office with a beautiful, south-facing window that gets sunlight all day long, and you have your crystal inkwell that's sitting right there and the sun is just beaming down on that ink all day long, over time, that ink is going to degrade in color and it's going to degrade in quality because of that UV exposure from the sun. Even some UV exposure from some fluorescent lights won't really help it out. It's not as bad as direct sunlight, but still, you're still getting UV exposure from fluorescent lighting even. So you just want to be careful about that. And that's not really so much of a transferring to it, but that's just generally when using crystal inkwells or any other type of inkwell like that. And honestly, that's the case for even just a regular bottle of ink. It's not even transferring, just using a bottle of ink. If you keep it out all day long in direct sunlight, over time, and some inks are more affected than others, but over time it could degrade the color of the ink itself as you're using it. It's not anything I would be too super paranoid about, but it's just if you really want to maintain the integrity of your ink color, just keep it in the box that it comes in or keep it in a desk drawer or something like that. I know it kind of somewhat defeats the purpose of having your beautiful inkwell displayed, just you have to use your judgment, and there's a trade-off sometimes of doing that. The other thing you asked about using a pigmented or particled ink such as 1670, and by the way, the reason that I think inkwells used to be a lot more popular is because before you had fountain pens using like liquid fountain pen ink, you had dip pens, which dip pens, like the old school like calligraphy and quills and that kind of thing, those used a lot more pigmented inks and a lot more inks that were light fast. So that wasn't as much of an issue with the light and stuff like that. And honestly, I don't think that most people really cared. Probably, I'm making a complete just call based on no reality whatsoever. But my assumption would be that back when fountain pens were just an everyday writing instrument, before you had ballpoints and all that stuff, fountain pens were just a pen. You didn't care whether your black ink degraded slightly in color and it became a really, really dark gray instead of a black. Or you didn't care whether your blue ink was slightly less blue. As long as you could still read it on the page, you didn't care because it was a utility. So you would use a crystal inkwell because it was practical and you had it out and you would just use it, and it wasn't as romantic as it is now because there are far fewer of them. It's much less of a commodity. So I think that may be a factor as well. I don't know, I just completely pulled that off my head. Just completely pulled that out of thin air. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe tell me what you think about that if I'm totally just blowing smoke. But there you go. So that's pretty much it. And then if you're transferring an ink like 1670 that has some particulate and stuff like that in there, just make sure you're shaking it really well. That's the thing, is you're going to have some particulate that's going to drop to the bottom of that bottle. And if you just take it, it's sitting there for a while, and you just take it and pour it, you're going to be left with some of that particulate down on the bottom. So shake the living daylights out of it like for a minute or two. And then as soon as you're done shaking it, transfer it to the new Inkwell, and you're going to see that all that stuff is gone out of the old bottle, and you're going to be good to go. Cool.